So thank you very much, Derek, for the introduction. Thank you all for attending. So today I will be talking about some of our initiatives to actually address one of the points that Derek described as the mission of the Eye on Earth Consortium, making knowledge more accessible and also more clearly represented. And indeed, the project we will discuss is how to actually push that knowledge out of people's heads and into a space where people can use it to mobilize information and data. So as you've heard, I come from a polar research institute, and of course one would wonder, well, of course Eye on Earth is very inclusive, but a little bit about why or where I come from and why I'm approaching the SDG process here. So one of our major projects at the AVI is the construction of a pelagic observatory. Well, it goes from the surface ocean and the sea ice to the deep sea. It's very integrative. It has a lot of data coming from the different disciplines. And of course, a lot of knowledge has to be integrated too. So we have a knowledge integration challenge. We also have a challenge that comes from connecting our scientific outputs to societal goals. And indeed, if we start up there, when people sample things in the field, they sample the water, they sample the ice, we do various things to it to extract information about the communities that live there. And we analyze things to output information artifacts like the health of the oceans, or if there are invasive species present, or what's going on in that water mass. And we would like to then connect it to the SDGs that are relevant to that process. And this connection has to be, in our opinion, or at least in our data management opinion, a little bit more than simply words in a report. We'd like a little bit more of a solid connection there. And then this is what brings me to trying to represent knowledge across all of these different things, all of these different components, so that the data flows more readily. The initiative that we're working on, the FRAM initiative, is nested or within a consortium called Atlantos, so an Atlantic Observing System. And the idea there is to sort of bring together a wide set of existing ocean observing activities and consortia to start sharing data to give a global picture of that oceanic ecosystem, and then feed back into groups such as the GOOSE or GEOS, large groups concerned with keeping the data as harmonized as possible to give a more global picture of ecological dynamics. In this realm, such a project is divided into work packages, and if you take a look at work package 8, WP8, there is focus on societal benefits, what comes out of it, how does it connect back into the broader human context of our biosphere. And indeed, the language of that work package includes things like sustainable fisheries and jobs, benefit sharing, ecosystem services, and the common good, language which I'm sure most of us who are participating now are familiar with. It starts to overlap quite a lot with what we hear in the SDG process. Exactly. So in that context, we want to enable this data flow. So this brings me to how we actually try to encode that knowledge so that it's encoded clearly, coherently, and it's actionable. You can do something with that knowledge once it's transformed. So make a sort of analogy about this, we can think of how we started to encode information. Early encoding of information, cave paintings, pictograms, etc., they conveyed a certain message. They conveyed it as best they could. However, there's a lot of interpretation that can occur. As time goes by, that kind of expression was structured more and more so that it could be more precise, more directed, and less open to ambiguity as language has developed. Now, we would like to try to do the same thing with the knowledge layer of information-rich environments, which is floating on top of our data and information. It qualifies it. Unfortunately, that's quite hard. This slide from Raskin, who worked on an ontology, the suite ontologies for NASA, is very revealing in this regard. Understanding the semantics of something, the meaning behind it, the knowledge that qualifies it is difficult. If it's a variable, they can be parsed in very different ways. What is the surface to people, or what is above the surface, can vary between groups. Abbreviations are quite toxic often. Grammatical structures are also somewhat dangerous at times and prone to misinterpretation. Things that are encoded with classification schemes need a decoding layer in order to be widely approachable. And of course, different formats or different ways of forwarding information or conveying information can have quite a different result. There we go. So again, the challenge now is not one of encoding information. It's not one of it's not one of encoding information. It's one of encoding the actual knowledge behind it, the semantics behind it. And in a way, it's like it reminds me of this book by Randall Munroe from XKCD fame. He's a comic artist, but he also used to work very much in the planetary science domain. This is a very interesting book, and it kind of explains what we're going to talk about here, how to encode knowledge. The words aren't so important, but it's more about the things themselves and their relations to one another. We can substitute those labels with any language or any useful syntactic label, but the important thing is what they're doing, what those things are, and how they connect to each other. And that's actually the theme, the logic that we use to start encoding knowledge. We could do that for things like smartphones. We could also do that for things like cells. Simple words, but that convey the actual nature of the entity itself. So this connects to a tradition that's been around for quite a while, ever since Plato and Aristotle, here shown in this fresco. Here we see Aristotle with his hand facing downwards and Plato pointing upwards. Plato pointing up to the realm of forms, the ideals, and Aristotle indicating downwards to things that exist in the world. This is the intentionality that we will approach modeling knowledge with. We are concerned with the Aristotelian approach. Things in the world that are stable, that are observable, very much empirically found. We detect them and we classify them. We classify them into groups and represent the knowledge behind it. And we do this using ontology. In the modern sense, an ontology is a representation of real-world entities, or a way to capture the nature and interconnections of real-world entities, or knowledge about them. Importantly, it's human-readable, but it's also machine-readable. So a machine can actually travel across this, this knowledge graph that we will assemble and sort of mimic the decisions that, that are made by a human. So let's try to visualize it as a knowledge graph. Indeed, it's controlled, it's logically structured, and it represents reality. Machines and humans can both understand it. Now, that's important in the sense that that logical structure allows programmatic access to it. It's predictable, the way that it separates the world and sort of unpacks what is often very fuzzy human knowledge. The nodes in that graph are classes in ontology, and each entity has its own class. These can be understood as terms. And it may have one or more labels. I may call it a forest, I may call it a woodland, but the important thing is its relations to other things that will actually define it more than simply the word used. The relationships between the classes, the things that link one entity to another, are also defined. They're not overly unstructured. They have definitions. They are also predictable. So we'll go into an example as an to help understanding. The main hierarchy in this graph is formed by these things called subclass relations, in which you can have things like B, which are subclasses of things like A. And we write a definition in an Aristotelian form where we define B by referencing A and then identifying some C, which distinguishes all B's from all other kinds of A's. So it's called the genus differentia model. Quick example, a red chair is a chair which has a red quality. Very simple, but this is what keeps the graph predictable and somewhat clean. So here we say that the genus would be the collection of all chairs, and red chairs are distinguished by having some red quality. That can be encoded logically, and if the machine knows what a chair is and what red is, it can then infer what a red chair is and set it apart from other entities. This can then be linked to data about what is red, what is observed as red. making it a little bit more complicated and probably more satisfying, we can take something like an oasis. And if we then connect it to other kinds of environmental types, we can start to say what makes an oasis different from other kinds of, in this case, vegetated areas. So an oasis is a vegetated area. Importantly, it has to have a spring as a part. It then is surrounded by, or partially surrounded by, some sort of solid material. It could be sand or rock or soil, and that sand, rock, or soil is arid. Now, that is a way to take what we intuitively understand an oasis as and encode it in a manner that a machine can sort of move around. If you have data associated with aridity or moisture coming from remote sensing, for example, and land cover information, you will be able to detect vegetated areas and also dry soil areas or dry sand areas, and then automatically classify what an oasis is. This is a way to take that human knowledge and sort of confirm that observations are linked to common conceptualizations or representations of knowledge about environmental entities. So in ENVO, in the environment ontology, we have taken some standards that exist out there already, such as the biome classification from the WWF, and we perform something called semantic unpacking, where we take something that is typically written for humans, let's just take these two examples here, and we separate it out into other entities that a machine can more readily parse through. So this is referred to as unpacking that expert knowledge. So here at the very bottom, we see that class, a subtropical broadleaf forest biome. It has some sort of planetary condition, subtropical, describing the climatic zones. And then it belongs to a hierarchy of biomes working up through other kinds of broadleaf forests, differentiated by, so our bottom class there is differentiated by having that subtropical condition, then to forests in general, terrestrial biomes in general, and finally into a top-level class that is simply biome. Again, that's how we take some human knowledge, unpack it, and encode it into an ontology. I won't go into the technical, the language we use to do that. It's the web ontology language, but certainly you can always ask me more about that later. So now when we come to sustainable development, we have a very unique situation because it's quite all-encompassing, at least in our planetary context. It's quite an all-encompassing program. Indeed, it includes the entire planetary system, the ecosystems within it, the natural ones and the anthropogenic ones, the socioeconomic systems within it, and also the systems that allow those systems to interface. So it's very much an overlapping network of things that are interaction with one another. And indeed, it correlates very well with this planet that we're on. It's very much like a spaceship, to use an analogy that's been circulated around. It's our spaceship. And understanding how it works and how to maintain it is quite important, as it's the only one we have at the moment. So when we have things in the SDG process, such as indicators, and this draft came out of a UN environment proposal to create multi-purpose indicators, we start talking about things on that planet, things in this spaceship that are quite involved in terms of knowledge. So if we even just take the first one, when we're mitigating hazard impacts. So the whole set of hazards out there, there are many of them. There's drought, cyclones, volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, etc. All of those entities, in order for a machine to understand how to mitigate these hazards, should be somehow represented, should be somehow exposed to that machine, what it means, what the dangerous parts are, what processes they come from. And in ENVO and other ontologies, we can try to put it together to, again, build a sort of thing explainer, a naive physics for a machine to understand one or more of these hazards. So in order to support that work, we've created several classes, and here we have an example of one. Now, these are not just, as you see, there are terms here, there are words here, but those words are incidental. They're just labels. You can substitute them with other languages or other descriptions if you wish, but the important thing is the relations that they have to one another. So again, if there's a volcano erupting, using classes from an ontology called CHEBI, which deals with chemical entities, we know what the outputs of that thing are. And those classes connect onwards into a very large and involved web of knowledge about chemicals. The same is true on the ENVO side. Those parts of our planet, those elements that participate inside an eruption process, are mapped out, and they have further links to what they are made out of, where they come from, what their formation processes are. So this allows you to access knowledge from many different directions. You can ask about any hazards that involve the release of hydrogen sulfide, and you will be led to this. You could ask about any hazards that have volcanoes as participants, and you would be led to a volcanic eruption process, etc. So this allows knowledge to be much more accessible from a multifaceted sort of realm. And we move on to other entities, things like what appears to be a forest. And these entities, of course, also have to be described for indicators that are concerned with, for example, the total forest coverage in a particular area. However, there's a lot of variation in how people understand things like forests, which, again, is very hard to be very precise about without trying to externalize that knowledge, without trying to write it down the same way that things were written down in words or letters or drawn on cave walls. An example from work by Lund is exploring the various definitions that come out when people talk about forests. And his work has been mapping them, and they're differentiated by things like administrative features, the coverage intensity, how that land is used, etc. And at the bottom right of that table, you'll see that there are over 1,500 definitions of forest that are used in his work in 2013. There are probably much more by now. Stabilizing that is important because if we're talking about forest, it can dramatically change how people understand what's happening to the ecosystem around them. And this need has been expressed in several papers that have been released. Here's just an example of one of them. Indeed, while this semantic variation exists, reporting on forests becomes very, very difficult indeed. And in fact, work by Sexton et al. In Nature Climate Change has illustrated that simply by changing one of those definitional parameters, the world's forest coverage looks very, very different. So again, definitions do matter, and trying to hold them in some sort of harmonized format, a format that where they share the same sort of basis, the same sort of logic, would be very advantageous. I could imagine this. Imagine then a service where you could navigate through different kinds of semantics, different kinds of worldviews, different definitions adopted, and filter out how the world looks, depending on the outcomes. So of course there are definitions of forest that are then more globally accepted, such as the Food and Agriculture Organization's definition of a forest. However, if we take quite a close look at that, it also includes things that are not, strictly speaking, forests. So the label and the semantics are somewhat removed from one another, which is, of course, operational. There's a good reason for that. However, it can lead to quite a lot of confusion unless it's mapped out a little bit. So this would include forests that have those parameters. They have a minimum height, etc. But also it includes things like young natural stands, which do not yet have those features. And that could be a little bit problematic. It'll also include things like forest roads or forest nurseries, cleared tracks within a forest, or plantations, which actually have a land use forestry. So this is quite, again, a complex and involved definition, and mapping that out could be advantageous. And indeed, this is what we're trying to do in the environment ontology, which then feeds into the Sustainable Development Goal interface ontology, as we'll see a little bit more of later. So that's the main intention of this idea of encoding. We have different ideas of what something is in our head, even if we think we agree. And the idea is to externalize that, point to the things in an external representation of knowledge that are meaningful to us, and then change that external representation if it's not satisfactory, so that when we build things like data interchange formats, etc., we can actually identify what precisely we're talking about and what data can be moved back and forth. So that's where we're going with the Sustainable Development Goals interface ontology. And again, it's a way to connect knowledge from different domains into the themes and the goals themselves and the knowledge surrounding them. So it's roughly divided into sort of three major components. One would be the actual real-world processes and entities that are out there, things like forests or hydrothermal events, etc. Then things that are information-related entities, such as the data that's coming out of monitoring programs and how they fit together. We distinguish them so we know what the data is about and how the data relates to other data objects. So again, that's knowledge about the data. And then there are the what we call UN constructs as a shorthand. But again, the things like the targets, the goals, and the indicators, which are very specific to the SDG process, which again have to be defined, mapped out, and their relation to things like the data and things like the real-world entities has to be clarified. In some documents reflecting on the Millennium Development Goals, the interconnectivity of things was highlighted to be quite important, because while you're trying to pursue one goal, you often pull resources from the satisfaction of another goal. And indeed, to learn that lesson, those links, that interconnectivity of that knowledge of the system, such that you know that pulling here will affect another goal or another system, is vitally important. And indeed, that's the nature of building a knowledge graph through an ontology. The interconnections between different domains of knowledge, here color-coded, different types of knowledge, that's part and parcel of building an ontology. They're interwoven. So you know that if you are then trying to address an SDG that involves certain socioeconomic entities, you're going to be pulling resources from ecological entities, again, by that web of relations that we're constructing. Then we have an idea of what these things that are important for the SDG process, what they look like on that knowledge level, what parts they include, what boundaries they cross, and who has information about what part. If they map that information to the node in that knowledge graph, we can discover it that much more easily. So as an example, we've seen that SDG.io is being built for the SDG process, and it's pulling knowledge from other ontologies like ENVO. The sake of that is to reuse it, to not reinvent the wheel, but to reuse semantics, reuse technology that's already out there, and also influence its shape such that it's satisfactory for the SDG process. So this example, we're going to look at an ontology called the agronomy ontology that's being put together in collaboration with the University of Berkeley, Biodiversity International, and led primarily by the CGIAR. And that ontology is to clear up agronomic or clarify agronomic knowledge about agronomic practices, equipment, and interventions in the field. It connects with ENVO to see how those things impact local environments and what kind of ecosystems they connect with. And we're working on trying to then connect it to SDG.io and the goals and targets related to agronomy. Of course, I think this audience doesn't really need to be told, of course, that we have dramatically reshaped our planet, and a lot of it is dedicated to agronomic practices or the production of food through crop use. So if we have a very simple cropland biome and we have some sort of crop, in this case a zucchini, that is our entity of interest, we can connect knowledge about that entity and its locale using the relevant ontologies. So the zucchini itself can be described with crop ontologies and crop semantics, which are certainly out there. But if we zoom in, we can start talking about the environment that it has, the cropland biome where it occurs, and that would be present in ENVO. If we zoom in closer to that entity, there could be a carcass nearby, which is influencing its growth, and we can start to map that with ENVO. Also, the materials around it, that carcass is emitting ammonia, it's enriching the soil with ammonia, and if that is declared on an observational level and linked to an ontology term, we can start to understand what the possible impacts of that could be. Now, we're going to move from the observed world into the knowledge representation world. It's a big jump, but here we are. So the environment ontology will capture that ammonia-enriched soil, but it will interoperate with the chemical ontology or the chemical entities of biological interest ontology, which has been put together over many years. And what ammonia is, the knowledge about ammonia is encoded in there. So ENVO doesn't have to do it itself. It reuses an expert ontology of chemicals. And its role as a neurotoxin, its role as a fertilizer, its role as, and it's also its chemical properties are captured there. So there's again, you can access that information, or you know what the consequences of observing that could be. Now, this is infrastructure. One can think of it as infrastructure on top of which people can build, or developers can build, tools to take advantage of this encoded knowledge. Right. The same is true of the other material, air. Now, if we connect air in much the same way that we know that air is a part of an ecosystem, an atmospheric ecosystem, and of course, there are processes that end up polluting that air, which are encoded in ENVO and imported into SDGIO. And SDGIO, for the semantics of things like exposure or hazard, takes the understanding of exposure in the SDG context, links it to the actual material entity that is described by a more, say, neutral ontology such as ENVO, or more ecologically grounded ontology such as ENVO, to gather those characteristics and also feed them into KEBI so that we know what kind of chemicals could be involved in that, what kind of chemical roles they have. And again, those graphs continue off in all directions. I'm just showing a very small subpart here, but the intentionality is the same. It's a way to merge knowledge from different disciplines to express something useful, which can then be used as infrastructure to build new tools on top of. Right? Another ontology that's popped up in this ecosystem quite recently is the food ontology. Collaborators from numerous institutes, the British Columbia Center for Disease Control, KAUST, UC Davis, Berkeley, and SFU, are involved in putting this together to start decoding food semantics, which is an immense task. But naturally, our food comes from the environment, and therefore that link was made very early on. In fact, Foodon was exported from ENVO, handed over to food experts, and we are co-developing those ontologies so they interoperate with things like agro and eventually SDGIO. So again, we're trying to align the semantics so things are interoperable, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And the knowledge is actually in the hands of the experts, or those who have access to expert communities. To remind you of what we saw before with OASIS, if we just think about one of those classes, things where vegetation occurs, that's often the foundation of some food chain. Those are the primary producers out there. So again, it's not hard to see that linking food and environment, it's a natural thing. It is the nature of the world. And the ontologies that we're using are based on this proposition. They're linked at that very basic level. So if you're using a food class from Foodon, the ontology knows, so to speak, that it is connected to environments through a particular path in the web of knowledge. The same is true here. Things that are linked, things that are marked with a red asterisk are, again, highly relevant to Foodon. And as we start to weave together the SDGIO with ENVO and socioeconomic ontologies that are dealing with laws, agreements, monitoring actions, legal ontologies, as those emerge, and we're trying to nurture those, we can start to make that knowledge graph denser, allowing this information or any information linked to those nodes to be discovered in new ways, in more flexible ways. And this also allows new communities to interface with the same data and knowledge structures, which I think is very sort of true to the Eye on Earth mission. So that's a rough idea of how we do it, of how we encode knowledge, using these graph-like structures, using a little bit something of more strict logic as we put together this graph. But then the question is, how do we actually get the knowledge? And that's the second part of this talk, and this is actually very, perhaps more relevant to most. But this is where most of you, I would imagine, could play a very, very important role. When we're encoding something, of course, we need something to encode. And that something is the knowledge that lies in experts' heads. And we're agnostic to who is correct. We are not searching for the best, in inverted commas, or so to speak, the best knowledge or the official knowledge. All of this knowledge, local knowledge, knowledge that is just emerging, alternative views on certain entities, as long as they have some sort of empirical evidence, which one can confirm and reproduce, we can start to encode this into that knowledge graph, so that, again, you can switch definitions. You can have views that are controversial. You can have dissenting opinions, but it's clear where these things exist. Those nodes are attributed to the people who gave them or contributed them to the ontology, and you can navigate through different modes of knowledge. So let's take a look at how that actually occurs, reminding us of how we then unpacked expert knowledge in something like the WWF biome classification. This is one way we can do it. We can approach something that already exists and start a semantic analysis of that, try to distill out more stable knowledge from it, and cast it in a way that a machine can understand. That's fine if it already exists. Often it doesn't exist, and we go back to that tradition of discourse. We need to actually engage experts, engage people who are stakeholders, who have knowledge about a system, and begin a discourse on it. So for example, in the environment ontology, we were approached to create terms that are architectural, open and closed eaves of buildings for a project here. This is the Norris ICE-MR. It's a malaria research project. And again, they needed some knowledge about these architectural features for their malaria project. And of course, we asked for their knowledge. We say, can you please propose such a definition? This is our development environment where everyone is free to contribute or ask questions. So then they came back to us, or they came back to me, and they illustrated what they meant and why it's important, how mosquitoes can get in and then infect people with malaria, depending on the kinds of eaves that are present. And again, we captured that knowledge and said, yes, of course, and integrated it into the ontology. This then is embedded into a whole range of other ontologies to express things like what a particular organism, what kind of disease they can carry, what pathogens they can carry, what phenotypes, what symptoms are associated with those diseases to help diagnosticians understand what's going on. Also, where such vectors have been seen. This was an outbreak in Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., which was quite unexpected. And again, mapping that to the environmental semantics connected with an outbreak of a certain virus is a complementary side to doing that geospatially. You can do this geospatially, but then that sort of hidden knowledge that you don't necessarily see or observe can also be captured semantically. So then you can discover data from both directions. We worked with NEON, the National Ecological Observatory Network, who are operating in the US, observing terrestrial environments and some coastal environments. They also have a wish to start to harmonize and standardize their environmental knowledge. So they approached us, and then they request the National Land Cover Database terms to be more semantically harmonized, to be parsed semantically and linked in with everything else that's out there. And of course, that means it's linked in to the SDGIO by virtue of the fact that ENVO and SDGIO cross-reference each other heavily. So we go through a certain process. We talk about it. We share expertise. This is just a snippet. I present then how we've done the modeling, how we've then parsed the definitions, what new definitions we have. We check if that's okay. We make sure that it maps to their identifiers, and we add any issues or comments where things are still perhaps a bit ambiguous, but where we've made progress. We've made progress at harmonizing that knowledge. As issues come up, things can be changed. Things can be changed if, for example, previous definitions of an older classification system are too restrictive. We can weaken them a little bit, because again, we're not simply reproducing a standard, we are sourcing knowledge from that standard and incorporating it into a living knowledge graph. We always back reference, of course, but we try to keep it as current as possible. And then we create them. So at the end of it, you'll see here a little table where those classes that they wished to be encoded have now been created. And you'll also notice that each class, each node in that knowledge graph is web accessible. You can put those PURLs or persistent URLs into your web browser, and you will go to that class in the knowledge graph. This is, again, the externalization of knowledge. You can access that online, and machines can access that online in a persistent way. So that if you wanted to link data about areas of barren land or areas of cropland to the knowledge of such a thing, you could simply map it using one of these PURLs and connect your system to a semantic system that's being that's operating with an ontology in the background. We also have that is our ENVO space, but for SDGIO with UN Environment, we have a community of practice where you're more than welcome to register for. I believe Derek will share information at the end of the session, and you can always contact me for that too. If you wish to join and contribute your knowledge of the concepts, the knowledge that you find particularly relevant to the SDG process, here you see a few example terms on resilience, vulnerability, risk, and basic services, please do join. Please do expose that knowledge so we can integrate it into this growing web of knowledge connected to the SDGs. It is plugged in to the Environment Live system, which I believe there will be an upcoming webinar in the EoE series quite soon. It's plugged in there. We are still making that link. We're still developing it further and further. But again, the idea is to have that sort of knowledge level integration as a possibility for others to use, and also to express their knowledge to make sure that their data is linked into the system smoothly, at least on a semantic level. It's quite new, it's quite nascent, so that's a good thing in the sense that it's mutable. If you have key knowledge that you believe should be in the system, then please do reach out, and we'll do our best to incorporate it. Right? I think that's my time. Just to close it, I'm just taking this as a conclusion slide that is just sort of saying, well, as we move into this phase where our planetary ecosystem is developing in the age of sustainable development, we do need a thing explainer for the whole process, because it's complicated and it crosses so many boundaries that a little bit of clarity can go a very long way indeed. And what we've seen here is one way to approach that on the semantic side, to actually encode it, to externalize it, and to allow it to persist, perhaps even as a legacy for the next round of development, while being useful to this one. We hope to continue to capture knowledge as more stakeholders are engaged. We wish to keep interconnecting things and aligning efforts that are out there, and there are quite a few, with these efforts so that things can connect to the SDG process, scientific initiatives, social initiatives, etc. And also we're more than willing to start training or helping people become independent and add to this semantic layer, this knowledge graph. We're more than happy to let expertise diffuse so people can do that independently. That's my time. My acknowledgements are, of course, to the AVI, to Antje Boetius, my group leader, the ERC that funded some of this work, UN Environment, particularly Jacqueline McGlade, Ludgard Coppens, Priyanka D'Souza, and Mark Jensen, and the whole team that's working on the ontology space in the background. So, as you can see there, and of course this has many contributors who share their knowledge with us, and we do microcredit, of course, and we link back to them. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Fantastic, really excellent. Thank you so much, Pierre. So now I would like to invite Bill Sontag from the Secretariat of the Group on Earth Observations to respond on behalf of the Eye on Earth Alliance.
Thank you, Derek. This is Bill. Again, thanks for your insight and all the work that you're doing in this area. The question of how to apply ontologies, concept management, semantics to the environmental information space is one that has been ongoing for at least the 18 to 19 years that I've been involved in this field, and I appreciate the progress that you're making and the pragmatism of joining ontologies together from various domains to start to make this work for us. I would urge all to give consideration to this in the following light. We are working in a system in the UN where we're asking national governments to report on progress towards sustainable communities and society through the SDGs. So the big challenge is creating the information ecosystem for that to occur. In particular, the one example that was raised here by Pierre in the forestry area is particularly germane to Goal 15, for instance, in the SDGs. And I'd like to see further consideration or deliberation on the question of uniting some of the FAO, UNCCD, and other areas of definitions for reporting on SDG 15, degraded lands, forestry, etc. So you hit a good one because it's a very real issue right now with the variety of vocabularies that are out there that we're attempting to connect. So my thanks for that. I'd leave with, again, just a quick reference. Anybody who's interested in a more popular view of this kind of work should consider reading a couple of books by David Weinberger, including the ironically named Everything is Miscellaneous, as well as the title Too Big to Know, a couple of things that help describe in a bit more popular terms what's being attempted here. So my thanks, Pierre, and I look forward to the next webinar, Derek, coming up, I think, on UNEP Live. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That's right. On June the 14th, we have Environment Live, the new branding for UNEP Live. So it is a nice segue from what we've heard today. And as Pierre has said, he invites members of the audience to take part in the community of practice, which we will be I will be sharing. In fact, there it is. That's the Pierre's contact information, information on the two ontologies he's described, and his personal email address. And as he said, he invites people who are interested to contact him directly. This is very important and very powerful work. So now we will turn to questions. So we have two questions in the system at the moment. I'm sure there'll be a lot more as people collect their thoughts. The first question is from an old friend, father figure in many ways of the Eye on Earth movement, Dr. Kostas Teregas. Kostas, your mic is open if you wanted to put your question.
Thanks, Derek, and thanks very much, Pierluigi, for that excellent presentation. I'm sure glad that you took some time to tee up the whole topic of semantics, because many of us don't have that background, so it helped understand the later slides. So much appreciated, and I know that your slides will be helpful to me as I try to explain these concepts to friends. The question is kind of an organizational one about incentives, and I'm just wondering whether you can address the question of what incentives are possible to encourage organizations with expert knowledge to adopt ontology principles and rubrics, and are the things we can do to support such a movement. I know, for example, I'm on the board of directors of EcoCity Builders, and you were kind enough to spend some time with our executive director, Kirsten Miller, to try to see if we can develop ontologies for ecological design of cities, and that was very helpful to her and the staff there. But you know, there are thousands of organizations, and you don't have the time to do all that one by one. So how can we address this incentive issue? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you hit a very important issue there. Also in academia, it's the same. How do you reward people for adding that knowledge, and what do they get out of it? Well, first and foremost, any knowledge that's added to these ontologies, if it's coming from an individual and they wish to be identified with some sort of identifier, their name, or an organization identifier, we include that. We will add that. We will also add that organization's coding system as a property on each class, so that it's exposed to the wider community what their knowledge is and how it's being used. Then if that knowledge, if that understanding of a particular ecosystem, a particular phenomenon, a particular entity involved in the SDG process, if that is used by others, if that's recirculated, again, each class has a unique identifier. So one can track how widely used, how widely adopted such a thing is. It also is a way to attract feedback, because once you expose it out there, people with who have views that perhaps can contribute to the refinement of that concept can approach you, can actually know who to talk to about such a thing. It creates, in a way, a network of people as much as it does a network of knowledge. That's the sort of, well, that's the sort of value that I see as primary. And then secondary, everything that is developed here is public right away. So if you are developing some sort of product or data mobilization tool or analysis tool, if you wish to just use that knowledge to improve your analysis, to enhance it, it's out there for you by that exposure. You can allow others to use that knowledge to work on their data. This is quite common in biomedicine, for example, or biology, where things like the gene ontology, one of the more successful ones that exist out there, are being used frequently for medicine. They're being used frequently for genetic studies, etc. And ENVO is also starting to be used more and more by people who want to analyze information using different renditions of knowledge, so to speak. So I guess it's this give and take scenario for reward, in summary, and it just creates it creates a very actionable community of practice on a knowledge level.
There is a question from Gayatri Ragwa. Gayatri's asked me to read her question. She has a sore throat. She says, I love the structure and logical way of putting things together. My question is, how would we be able to use these knowledge graphs in the field of education? We teach students, we need to observe the interconnections, but are unable to show these in a clear, structured manner. I was impressed by the way how the biome was described.
So yeah, the potential for use in education is quite high. Just as an example, very recently we released a polar representation for polar environments, different kinds of ice, different kinds of snow, glacial processes, etc. And I use that very frequently with my students when I need to teach them about polar environments. You simply can give them that graph. There are interactive ways to show this knowledge graph. And you can navigate along the links. There are various software tools that are out there that allow you to navigate through ontologies and read the definitions, see the interlinkages, and understand how one thing fits into another. In some of the empirical fields, this is quite straightforward. In the SDG process, of course, there can be multiple ways of seeing how things fit together. And that's not insurmountable. Indeed, you can filter what kinds of links you wish to see. You can even say, well, who are they from? Are these then officially sanctioned? Are they sanctioned by some sort of organization? Or are they cutting-edge research? And again, if we are, and as we do, credit people who are putting things into the knowledge graph, you can then navigate the knowledge of a certain organization. You can navigate the knowledge of a certain group of researchers. It really depends on what has been put into the graph. So for teaching, of course, I think it's very directly actionable. The one thing that's a bit of, it's a slight inhibition there, is that a lot of our definitions of terms in semantics tend to be quite dry because they're logically structured. So actually working with UNEP, who picked this up very early on, we also include, or have started to include in the SDG.io, more intuitive definitions to allow people to try to grasp the intention of the definition. These aren't authoritative, but they certainly can help with learning.
Thank you, Pierre. Sangitu?
Yeah, my name is Sanigitu. I'm calling from Cross River State, Nigeria. You spoke about the national government being able to set out the strategy, and in a scenario that the national government seem not to understand the issues around, and the subnational don't have a lot of understanding and have been participating, how do we go about it? That's my question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I think this is actually one of the most direct uses of such an approach. If the government, or if national governments have a certain knowledge about what's going on in their country and what entities and processes affect the SDG process, they can encode that. Then if, again, this is where that capacity building comes in. All of the tools we use to build these things are free. I mean, everything is openly accessible. The licenses are very relaxed. So if there are communities, regional, sub-regional, or even local communities that wish to push their knowledge, which may be at odds with other systems, to the same layer, again, we are agnostic. We're happy to host that. And then conversations can start. And conversations can start in a very precise way because you know exactly where in the knowledge graph the disagreements are. So I think it's mostly a question of capacity building. If there is such a sense that there are disagreements or there are conflicts in knowledge, it's again a question of reaching out to that community, asking them to express that knowledge, and then allowing us to translate that into a knowledge graph like this. I mean, what we're doing here is fairly sophisticated, and there can be simpler models of doing this if you want to get things in there quite quickly with low demands on training. So I suppose that would be the way you'd go about it. Approach those communities, ask them to push their knowledge to the same knowledge graph so that we can see where things diverge.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thank you for the question. Nice to hear someone speaking from Nigeria. We have another question in the chat from Bruce McCormack. Bruce, I've opened your mic if you wanted to put your question.
Thank you very much. My question is quite straightforward. What is the quality control mechanisms that you build in? And I just quote in my chat there as an example, if a whole bunch of sort of inverted commas, semi-loony climate change denier kind of people started flooding your system, how would you deal with that?
Excellent point. So we always, again, we come from a tradition of realist ontologies. And that, again, since it's a scientific tradition, we do need some sort of truth maker to the things. It's not simply ideas. We don't, as is commonly said by several ontologists, you don't have ontologies of unicorns. You can have an ontology of an idea of a unicorn, but not of the unicorn itself, because it doesn't exist. So again, we do have a standard of empirical evidence. We do ask people to connect us with the resources that are the truth maker of their knowledge. And then we add that to our ontologies. If it's an idea or a hypothesis, that can also exist, but it exists as a hypothesis, not as the actual bona fide thing out there in the world. And of course, at least with the SDG content, SDG.io content, the community of practice is serving to enhance the quality. We go through a round of review, internal review, using the COP. It's happened for a few of the key terms, and I think that's something that we could really benefit from interaction with the Eye on Earth Alliance members. We have our definitions. We have our proposed definitions that are either contributed or which we've added. And then experts in the field or people who are working for agencies that are actually implementing the SDG process can feed back on that and say, well, you're completely off target, or this is good, but needs some slight modification. We go through a round of review and we update the ontology accordingly. Importantly, every revision of the ontology is logged. So the history is completely transparent. You can rewind it, you can use a previous version, etc. So there's that. But in terms of quality control, we generally try to, again, interface with experts or use trusted sources, and we minimally require a truth maker to exist with some reasonable empirical evidence behind it. Of course, people are also are completely capable of complaining. Like if, again, one cannot be an expert in everything, so if something does sneak in, the community can do a sort of peer review process and say, well, no, this thing does not exist in that way, and we will open it to a round of review.
Thank you, Pierre. Sriram, I'm going to open your mic if you wanted to put the question.
Lovely session, and Pierre, there's a lot of detail in data modeling. It's wonderful. Sure, it's taken a lot of time. My name is Sriram from India. I represent a social enterprise working on climate change impact activity in urban India. And one key area we sometimes struggle is creating the impact model, and the data structure in this and the whole model seems an opportunity for us to use it for measuring the impact we are having on various SDGs. Is that a valid use, and if so, how do we access it and how do we use it?
Mm-hmm. So all the ontologies are. Oh, of course. Thank you for your participation and question. All ontologies that we're working on here are freely available online. Every development stage is transparent. You can use them. There are no restrictive licenses or so. Now, when it comes to impact, this is interesting because the SDG process is unfolding. We are now learning what is a resilient community, what is a vulnerable community. We see things changing in front of us. The truth makers are developing out there. So if you are aware of such systems, the way that one could use this is to actually record what you saw, the knowledge about what has happened. It may already be present in the ontology, but if it's not, that's some place you can either reach out to us, or if you're familiar with the whole software environment, you can simply suggest a set of changes to us. You can push a set of changes to us. and we can co-develop that. Again, we're very open to co-development. So if you have use cases, real-world use cases of where you say, where you have good evidence that impact has happened and the way in which it has happened is logged, well, we can start to translate that into the semantic layer and integrate it into this knowledge graph. Of course, our capacity, we have a limited bandwidth, and this is why we stress capacity development. If we can train somebody on your side to do it themselves and co-develop with us, we're more than happy to do that. So we have more multipliers working in this community and pushing knowledge, not just data, but also the knowledge to use that data into the system. We're happy to support that.
Hey, excellent. Thanks for the detail. I just opened the website and I'll take a look and I'll reach out. I think in the, I'm sure in the conclusion email, I'm hoping I'll get your contact if to find a way to reach out to you.
I think my name is a unique identifier, so you shouldn't have trouble.
Okay, great. Thanks, Pierre.
I think it's a globally unique identifier. And Pierre's email, in fact, is on the screen at the moment at the bottom of the page.
Yeah, great.
There is a last question from Alexandra Fant.
Working at the IUCN Environmental Law Center in Bonn, and I'm supporting multilateral environmental agreements to develop a controlled vocabulary. And how do you identify those ontologies that you link with? You mentioned agro and food on, and what is the standard for an ontology to qualify?
Yeah, so yes, there's this gradient of things from vocabularies to thesauri to fully fledged logical models. So the ones that we identify and use, we prioritize this interoperability, that things are being developed with the same basic best practices. And we refer to the OBO Foundry best practices. That's the Open Biological and Biomedical Ontology Library and Foundry. Now that community has existed for quite a long time. It's had a lot of input from linguists, philosophers, domain experts, biologists, and computer scientists to develop like a functional model of growing a federation of ontologies. And again, this is why these ontologies can talk to each other so easily, is because they have similar tool decks in the background, similar software tooling. So we identify them based on, again, what we do a quick quality check. We say, well, you know, are they following those best practices? Are they understandable? Are they accessible? And also, are they responsive? Can they do they respond to requests, and do they change or update their content as needed? In the community where we work in, this becomes more and more apparent as time goes by, and we try to prioritize interacting with them. Of course, this doesn't mean we're restricted to them. If there are clever ways to interact with SCOS, thesauri, or anything else, we're open to figuring out how to do that. It has to be an inclusive space after all.
Okay, many thanks.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Pierre. So with that, I need to bring the webinar to a close. I thank everyone who stayed on the call for this long. And once again, I thank Pierre very much for his time and fantastic work. Bye, and speak to you on the 14th of June. Bye for now.